Hi, I'm Walter, and I'm the Dutch mentor, also known on my YouTube channel and my Instagram channel as Fly with the Dutch Mentor. Welcome. Today is a mock session on my CFI helicopter, which is scheduled for a few weeks from today. And I thought it would be a great idea to do a dry run through on what it is that I plan on presenting to the DPE. So obviously there are two parts to our CFI exam. We always start off with the oral examination, and once successfully pass that, you will be transitioning to the in-flight portion. We are not going to cover the in-flight portion today. I might do a separate video at some point in time to talk about how to proceed and what you can expect. And maybe I'll do that after I've completed and I visualize a successful completion, of course. The oral examination will be done in a private setting between you and the DPE. And of course, you have a choice now as a CFI student or candidate to make this DPE feel like they are a student, and you guide them from the second they come in, and you take charge of the session in order to be able to meet all the performance expectations of the exam itself, which I'm sure has been shared with you in a document. It's really no different than what you have been doing in your VFR, your commercial Checkride. Of course, this is more about how you are now going to teach the DPE components, not all of it, of course, components to show competency in your ability to teach a student. The tricky part, of course, is that what kind of a student do I have in front of me? Right? Do I have a brand spanking new student who's coming in for an introductory, where you might have to just simply do an SFAR 73 introduction awareness before they can go up? Or are you working with a VFR student who is 20 hours in and pre-solo? Or a commercial student who is well on their way? Obviously, we are not going to be covering the CFII portion in this oral exam, and that is scheduled for later this year, and I hope to be able to complete that again. I set a goal for myself to have all of this done before the end of 2024. Of course, you might see this at a later time since I will be housing this on my YouTube channel. So the objective here is to teach the designated examiner, the DPE, the fundamentals and the concepts of teaching. Right, and that's really the key that we need to get across here. Is this is not just a knowledge exam. This is really about utilizing all of the resources available to you and teaching techniques that you have picked up along the way in order to be able to get the point across to the student. And that varies, of course, from student to a great deal. We'll cover that a little bit more in the fundamentals of instruction. So the lesson plan and the overview of what the DPE, the student, from this point forward can expect is a 90 to 120 minute session. Now, normally speaking, I would never teach for 90 to 120 minutes for the simple fact that it will be 1 ear in, 1 ear out after about 20 minutes, right? It is exceptionally important to be able to break down our lesson plans to 20 to 30 minutes max. We need to allow the student to absorb the information and to literally download from short-term memory into long-term memory. We also should not teach down to the very specifics and advanced settings in the first sitting or the second or maybe even the third sitting, because it takes time to connect the dots. And again, that's very different from all the students. So we're going to make an exception here that the lesson that we'll be teaching will be a variety of different topics. None of them should take more than 20 minutes at a time in order to be able to ensure that there is a way of processing the information and make it more tangible. We are going to be referring to materials that we have found in our helicopter flying handbook, the FAR AIM, the flight training materials that have been shared with me, and of course whiteboard and PowerPoint presentations that will be a combination of teaching tools for the different subjects that we'll be coming to cover. So what is it? I put it into a way that it makes sense, that you feel like you're going on a journey. And of course, we cannot teach all of the points, but I think that it would be good to have a discussion about the fundamentals of instruction. So here I can demonstrate on what I need to take into consideration when working with a student. We're going to start with aeronautical decision making, or ADM, We know that a large portion of helicopter accidents are due to pilot error. So using the PAVE model, we can have a discussion, and I have slides, and I also have a handout for the students, something to take with them. And again, most decisions, great decisions, the go, no go decision is made in this section. Second most important thing is, of course, the weather and risk management. And these are, closely tied together. We should not go out without really understanding what the environment is like, right? That's part of the environment, or the V of the PAVE model. We'll talk about that, and we'll actually dive a little deeper into how to read weather reports. Before we fly, and now you are an official student, we're going to go to the SFAR 73 and some of the helicopter systems. Now, I've chosen to do the SFAR 73 as a teaching tool because it is a really good opportunity to talk more about energy management between altitude, between speed, and between rotor RPM. These three principles hold true in everything we do in helicopter flying. And again, the management of these three are essentially exceptionally important during all phases of flight, and of course emergency procedures as well. We'll talk a little bit about the helicopter advanced aerodynamics, both basics and advanced, and allowing the student to select 2 or 3 topics we can cover today in our session. And then it's about FAA regulations and endorsements. We will refer to in handout that is a company, standard. But of course, you can refer back to the FAR AIM as well with specific regulations on what it is that you are required to do as a CFI in order to support your student's journey itself. And then in the back end, we're going to utilize what we call a teaching methods and scenario-based training model, where we will present a couple of different models, including a trip from Stewart Air Force Base to Albany and all the things that go into effect. And some of the supporting documentations that we can find and we'll be utilizing are, of course, VFR and helicopter charts, weight and balance for the particular aircraft on that particular day and configurations. We'll talk a little bit about the FAA flight plan, both paper and digital format. We certainly will talk a little bit more about for flight planning. And then, of course, how do we get a 1-800 weather brief, or we get weather information along the route of travel in our for flight plan. So that is the goal that we have set for ourselves today. And I will go through these at pretty quick speed. Obviously, it's very difficult for me to formulate my own questions from the presentation itself, but you kind of have to imagine what that would be like. So at this point, I would stop and ask the question if there's any expectations from the student, from the DPE on my presentation style or expectations. And I would think from what I've heard from others is that you have wide range as long as you come with a plan. The key is have a plan in hand, have a way to execute. If you come in unprepared with things all over the place, then obviously that takes a different direction. But again, my goal is to be able to come up with a plan of action and lay that out so the student knows how to expect that, and to utilize the tools that are available to me through storytelling and discussion. So taking my own deep personal experiences along my path of learning and be able to discuss this, right? There are many mistakes I have made. And of course, students can learn from these. We want to rely somewhat on PowerPoint presentations, but we don't want to PowerPoint people to death either, right? We have interactive videos. I've QR codes embedded into my materials that the student could scan to be able to have a visual reference, especially to some of the aerodynamics or the emergency flight procedures that we have that come into play. Whiteboarding is either digitally or standing up at the board and be able to draw some of the imagery and explain some of these procedures or processes. And then, of course, using the books that are available to us. But I think that it's exceptionally important here, too, to remember that you can leave the room and go to this helicopter and actually do a walk around. Right? Talk about all the different systems of the helicopter by pointing and feeling and touching things. Right? Tactile learning is probably one of the best ways of learning for students. And once we complete our oral component, then we will be going to transition to the in-flight demonstration, which could include the pre-flight and pre-flight discussion with the student itself. All right, so it starts off with the fundamentals of instruction, right? It is really understanding what it is to be a teacher. And, I've been a teacher or a coach and a mentor for a long time. So this is more natural to me. And it really starts off by having a conversation with the person that sits in front of you and to break the barriers of not feeling that there is a superiority. I'm the boss, or I'm the teacher, you're the student, but how we can start building true relationships and into a partnership, that we are on this in this journey together. And it is taking your time to raise self-awareness and really trying to get to understand how this person is processing information. And the best way to do this and to ask them to go back to high school or college and have them explain to you how they learn. Do they take notes? Are they visual learners? Are they tactile learnings? And whatever it is you take away from their discussions is something that you want to be able to integrate in your teaching styles. So this is very much important to making sure that the information is retained that you relay. If you are giving the person PowerPoint after PowerPoint and they told you that they do best in video, well, that's not the best way of teaching. If they learn best by doing, then we need to make sure that we are heavily reliant on doing, although we can fall back on some of the materials like reading the helicopter handbook or doing an occasional PowerPoint presentation. So the key to success is to be able to find the best way for that person to learn in the environment that is comfortable to them, but also have to remember that we have to evaluate, right? So just because we do what they say doesn't mean that we should rely on that. We need to make sure that we go back and evaluate their ability to retain information. Now, I'll tell you for myself, I'm a pretty smart guy, but it took me 2, 3, 4 times to really, connect the dots in certain, certain procedures or maneuvers or emergencies to have them make sense. It was really learning both by reading, by feeling, touching, doing, and flying, and then continuous discussion until something that it finally sinks in. So be realistic in the expectation, but validate, right, that the person is receiving the information accurately, and that and that can then be put into practice. At the end of the day, this is not just a test of a mechanical skill; it's also a test of knowledge itself. So the principle of effective learning is by having clarity, right? It is that making sure that the student knows and understands what it is that we're trying to accomplish today. So there needs to be clear objectives, and these should be built into building blocks that leads to an end result of a person having deep knowledge around a certain piece of the puzzle, right? All the things that are expected of us to talk about in our VFR, commercial IFR examinations, no different than here at the CFI. But again, laying it out and setting expectations and clear objectives will allow the student to have a goal and set measurable objectives and milestones, and also have the ability to then teach back to the teacher, right? And that's where you really can start measuring if there's a real sense of retaining the information and a certain level of competency. See one, do one, teach one still holds true, right? And my father always told me that those people who can teach back are reaching a level of competency, not a level of experts, but a level of competency. I've been in training now for nearly 2 years. I am certainly no expert in helicopters. I am reaching a certain level of competency that I can talk about these things. But, as a good experienced helicopter pilot with, 10, 15 years under the belt, or, can easily peel back the onion 2 or 3 layers, and I will be going, right? So know what you know and know what you don't know. Again, teaching is about resource management. Teaching is not by requiring that you're the expert on everything that there is. So again, drawing on your resources of other CFIs or other students or YouTube, right, or Google. There's a wealth of information out there at your fingertips. You just need to know when to utilize it and adapt that for how your student is learning. The evaluation part of it is both in writing, by taking written exam or oral test or oral competencies, It can be formative and consummatory. So it can be on a day-to-day basis or lesson by lesson. It can be done by a segment. For example, in the VFR, there's a requirement that there is a test out before you go solo, right? So that there's summative an assignment that people need to complete in order to show that they have a certain level of competency around the skills, knowledge, and abilities before they can go out on a solo, which of course requires an endorsement on the part of the CFI in their logbook before they go out. Giving constructive feedback, and it can be very techy, right? It is not everybody is very competent at that, especially people who have never done this before. Sometimes we want to use the the hamburger model by giving somebody a compliment, while we then go into an area where they can have some improvement, and then finishing it back up by lifting them up by giving them another some insight of where they have reached a level of competency. It is a combination of these factors, but also I always say that feedback needs to be bilateral, right? It's very important that as you provide constructive feedback, never being mean, but constructive feedback to your student, it's equally important that you allow the student to give you feedback, right? It's about helping you identify the barriers to learning for that particular student and then how to overcome that. Now, listen, many people have hidden or have been suffering in silence with things like dyslexia or their inability to translate from their own primary language to secondary language. Again, we have to be sensitive to these things and set an environment where there is a strong trust bond between the teacher and the student, where these things can be discussed and we can help overcome these barriers. And again, there's a requirements that we have to meet, but it does not mean that all of the people have to meet that requirement in the same time frame, right? It's about getting to the point of competency at the pace that the student is capable of working. We have to be mindful of stress and lack of motivation and fear as key inhibitors to learning. As I teach in my own work every day, is that those who think with the lower brain often act out of fear or fight for flight. That's not a good place for memory to be stored for any length of time. We are reactors in that phase. So we have to make sure that the people are feeling comfortable in the situation, that there's open dialogue, there's an informative part of partnerships between two people in order to be able to get over that hump and learn how to be able to work what we call upper brain, where things can be processed and we can learn how to respond appropriately. Again, it's very important for the CFI to be open to critique and constructive feedback and make adjustments along the way. It is really through that process that we can become excellent teachers for the individual that's in front of us. Again, it's different one-to-one as if we do it in a group, right? In a group, sometimes we have to make adjustments. So that is really the portion of the fundamentals. What I would like to now do is I'm going to switch over to a PowerPoint presentation, and we will be talking about the ADM, aeronautical decision making, and how that is relevant. But it really starts off with really understanding that the danger of helicopter flying is not so much the machine. It is really the person. It's really the pilot in command. And if you go to the NTSB website where you look at accident investigations, and I would strongly encourage you all to do that, there are some clear factors here into play. And if and overall, 70 to 80% of them are really people dependent. So we cannot overemphasize this. This is not, we don't, you should not blame the machine for the accidents that are taking place. It's really the thought process, right? The ADM, the aeronautical decision-making process that often leads to poor outcome if people are not following a script that leads to safety, right? And PAVE is one of the scripts that we can follow to make sure we make really good go, no-go decisions. So loss of control in flight. Well, think about the Kobe accident, right? Here, some key critical decisions were made by the pilot that they were flown in less than desirable condition and lost control of the aircraft because of visibility issues and flying into a mountain. Right? This is not that uncommon. Controlled flight into terrain is that second part, which goes hand in hand with the first one. The third one is the mechanical failure. Yes, piston-driven or for that matter, turbine-driven accidents do take place. And there are clear examples that I have on my website that shows you where you can have a turbine engine failure or a piston engine failure. It is more important that we as pilots need to continue to be vigilant in training for such scenarios and be able to mitigate the outcome to the best possible outcome rather than obviously landing hard or crashing because we did not follow the set procedures to meet that particular emergency itself. Then we have about weather-related accidents. So again, there's a human factor in here is by not, taking weather serious enough. Oh, I'm just going around the corner and I'm not checking the weather, going out and accidentally flying into IFR conditions, leading to a poor outcome. Again, a lot of these things are driven by human decision making. And clearly, if you look at the NTSB reports, this is something that too often leads to poor outcomes. And then you have simple, straightforward pilot error and human factors that go into play. Bad decisions are made in different phases of flight that leads to a poor outcome. All right, let's switch over to the PowerPoint because in there we're going to be following the PAVE model in order to introduce this lesson plan and before we actually take off in flight itself. So what we're going to be doing in the slides here for aeronautical decision making is to really look at the human factor and what should take into account on a day-to-day basis or really flight-by-flight basis in order to make the right decisions for you, and if you're flying with passengers, for the passengers, right? You as a pilot in command on the end of the day is truly responsible for the outcome of a safe flight, right? Decisions in the air can make or break your day. So that's why we talk about them on the ground first, where safety starts. I've had plenty of times I came and checked on an aircraft and didn't like something, I didn't go. I checked out an aircraft and made a decision that the winds were just too out of control, too strong. Again, it's much better make a really good decision not to go and live another day than to go out there and say, "Oh, let me just see what it is like." Right? Be very, very cautious and listen to your inner voice in your brain itself. So the overview here is that we're going to be using the PAVE model. And to support that, we have this little acronym called the DECIDE model, right? We want to detect the fact that a change has occurred. We want to estimate the need to counter that. We need to choose a desirable outcome. We need to identify the actions which could lead to a successful outcome, do the necessary actions or adopt in order to be able to have a successful outcome, and then evaluate to see if the actions you have chosen are the right ones. And again, this is not just in the air. This starts on the ground itself, right? Using that guideline is really leads to positive outcomes. So of course, ADM is all about risk management, right? What is the probability that something will go wrong? And as you are studying the NTSB reports, where you should look at, or you listen to other CFIs or other students, what they have experienced, all these factors need to come into play. And using the PAVE model, we're looking at both the person, the aircraft, the environment, and then other external pressures that could lead to potential bad decisions. And we really want to say, we want to use this as making really good decisions, right? So let's start off with the pilot. So again, we love these little acronyms, right? I'm safe, right? The first checklist that a pilot should make as they get up out of bed in the morning is that, am I ill today? No. Am I taking any non-approved FAA medications? No. Do I have any situational or long-term stress that is impacting my sleep or could lead to fatigue? No. Did I consume any alcohol the previous 24 hours? No. Do I have any chronic fatigue? Or am I in a hyper emotional state? Again, by making this checklist for yourself, you can say, listen, am I ready to fly? And only once you make the determination that you would want to take a step forward. Now, be mindful again of that upper brain, lower brain component. You can lie easily to yourself because you have to get somewhere. We call that, the get there-itis. there's a timeline, there's a task that need to be completed. But all these things can become very, very dangerous, right? So when you make these decisions, making sure that you have a non-hazardous attitude and be very, somber about this on can I or can I not, and really kind of like, understand some of these, these, what do you call that? Some of these attitudes that you can recognize that could lead to potential poor outcomes. Obviously, you studied this on your exam for your written test. The big one is scud running, right? Is letting the aircraft or the situation get ahead of your competency. Right? You have to be very, very mindful about that and prevent that by all means possible. Pilot stress. So stress, is the body's normal response to demands that are being placed on it. Right? We are all have certain level of stress. The fact that I'm here sitting in front of a camera and talking to all of you, or if I am sitting in a room with a DPE and having a conversation around my oral exam or my flight exam, yes, my heartbeat is going to be up by 10 or 15 points. But it's all the other stresses that could also lead, in addition to, that might make it unhealthy for you to proceed. Right? And these could be environmental stresses. Is it hot or cold or humid? Or is there any noise or noise factors? Right? Are you physiologically, right, fatigued and from sleep deprivation? Are there any psychological issues between you and your wife or family members or at work? All of these things are cumulative. Again, stress can lead to a narrowed vision. Right? And narrowed vision can lead to what we talked about earlier, is your inability to make really good decisions. So again, use that model, the decide model, use the go, no go decision, make really good decisions based on am I safe to fly? Once you have a check mark there, then you move on to the next thing and say, all right, is the aircraft, the environment where the aircraft is, conducive to safe flight today? Right? So it's about having a really good pre-flight and a flight plan in place. What am I going to do? Where am I going? How high do I need to fly? How much fuel am I required to have? What are the minimum equipment I need to have on board? These are just checklist items you need to use. With a good FAA flight plan, it will help and guide you through that, right? But for yourself, you should not skip over these. Often we fly to 5 or 10 nautical miles to our local practice areas without completing all of these in great detail. Well, that's probably about the outer limit of safety for yourself, right? Because you have some places out, you know where you're going, you're familiar with the environment, you have plenty of landing spots, you have, in other words, it is, but none of it is a reason to not do a really thorough pre-flight. So the flight plan is one, but the pre-flight can never be skipped. Right? You want to lay your hands on the aircraft and have a systematic way of checking to make sure that everything is good. The next component is the environment, right? And we're going to dive a little deeper into that, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But know what the weather conditions are, not only now, but in the future, right? Meaning in the future, am I going to plan for a 90-minute flight? I want to see what the weather is going to be like in 90 minutes. Right? We want to pick up ADIS and ASOS and AWOS and other types of information along the route of travel to get updates to make sure that we understand what is at play. And of course, you have other options like getting a PIRAP or in a pilot reported from somebody who just came from the direction that you're flying into. So one of the pitfalls of ADM is the classical behavioral traps that we fall into, right? We fall into pressures of a particular flight. And here it is about, mostly, and it's really, when you think about it, this peer pressure, right? Is that by making a decision based on the pressures that others are giving to you, don't fall into that. Now you can read for yourself. There are multiple other ones, but peer pressure is the leading cause. Is going out and trying to get somewhere where you need to be, without really challenge yourself, is it safe to go there today? And all that requires to have deep situational awareness. And I always make the joke, if you go to the movie theater before the lights go out and you sit there with your big bag of popcorn and butter on it, your Diet Coke, what is the one responsibility that you have before the lights go off and the movie starts? Is knowing how to get out. So your situational awareness, what is happening all the way around you, what is happening in the near future, is something a key requirement of a really good pilot in command and decision that can be made. Am I safe to fly today? Is it safe to complete the mission today? And never hesitate, not once, when you say to yourself, I am not okay. The aircraft is questionable. The weather is not exactly the way I wanted. There are many outside pressures that I'm not 100% sure about. You say, I can go today. Those who don't fall, who fall into the trap of get-theritis or giving into peer pressure can get into trouble, right? And if you don't believe me, just go to the NTSB website and read some of the excellent investigations on why people died while flying. Don't make that part of you, right? Complacency, distractions, and stress and fatigue are key components of safe flight itself. All right, with that said, we're going to transition now to weather services. Oh, no, sorry, to SFAR 73. And SFAR 73 is a requirement for all helicopter pilots, Robinson in specific, 22 or 44 pilots, who want to go out and fly. So we have a quick awareness training, and we do an introductory flight. And then we have a more in-depth version of that. So this is the more in-depth version of that. That needs to be done by all students. There needs to be endorsement in the logbook itself of having met this requirement. And again, I always look at it this way, is that yes, this is an addition to. It's of course designed with the purpose of making sure that we have and conduct safe flight, which is the benefit of you as the pilot itself. So the awareness process. We'll talk quickly about the applicability. We'll spend most of our time on the energy management, low G hazards, rotor RPM decay, and then some of the requirements in the back end for the R22, R44 endorsements and the CFI reviews. All right, first thing is this was created obviously because something didn't go right? And it was created in conjunction with NTSB, and Robinson willingly adopted this, and it was put into play going back to February of 1995. Small adjustments and changes have made to this process, but this is still required for anybody who flies an R22, R44. If you have more than 200 hours on a biannual basis, anything less than 200 hours, this is still required to be an annual review with a CFI and endorsement as an acknowledgement. It is awareness, right? And there's a good reason for that, because accident happened, and especially in a way of not managing the energy in the aircraft well, which has led to, sadly, to unnecessary death. So again, the clear statement is that no person may manipulate the controls of an R22 44 unless awareness training has been completed and has been properly endorsed by a certified flight instructor. Period. That is a requirement. If you get a RAM check of the FAA and they cannot find this endorsement, you're technically speaking in violation with that. Right? There are multiple layers to this, and really the key of this whole conversation is about proper energy management in the aircraft itself. Right? Low G hazards or pushover hazards. Right? When we have less than zero, when we're floating in our the reason why that is because they can lead to mass bumping. Right? If you have a decay of our rotor RPM, which obviously has a visual and audible to it, it can lead to a blade stall, which can lead to almost guaranteed death at that point in time if you're higher than 40 to 60 feet off the ground itself. All right, simple basic reviews, and we talked about that in our walkarounds. We have a cyclic that controls the direction of flight, forward, backwards, left, and right. We have a collective that, essentially speaking, is up and down. Pedals on the ground, lower level, is turning left and right, and in flight is only for the purpose of maintaining trim in flight to reduce the drag on the aircraft itself. The throttle is to maintain and controls the air and fuel mixture to make sure that we have proper, optimum RPM production coming out of the engine. That then, of course, translates directly to RPM for our rotor. The governor helps control this, so we do not, have to manually do this. Although if there's a governor failure, we can do this manually as well. And then inside of the collective, as you raise it or lower it, there is a correlator that makes minor adjustments to provide additional power, especially during the lift portion itself. Okay, the key here is we have to think about it. This is about energy management. And energy management in an aircraft, we have to think about this as kinetic energy being used right now. Anytime we're in flight, our airspeed, in other words, we have talked about the very basic aerodynamics as we are uh, picking up forward speed, and the vortexes are going through translational lift to with and are being pushed back, and we're getting into undisturbed air, making it more effective to create lift and forward speed while maintaining RPMs in our rotor blade. That is what we have. That is stored. That is available to us, and we have to learn how to how to interact and maintain that for safe flight. The potential stored energy is our altitude. It's partly where we have what we call the HV diagram, that there's an area that we are vulnerable, right? When we are high and slow, or when we are low and picking up speed, right? If something, God forbid, happens, we cannot trade off altitude at low altitude in order to be able to maintain rotor RPM, right? So that's why we need to have it and takeoff profile that we have discussed. So in this way, we have to understand how we can trade energy off that in case something happens, and it is demonstrated here in the diagram itself on how we can go from an inflow, top to bottom movement of air, to upflow when we lose power, that we actually have the wind direction coming from the bottom up. And it's how we manipulate our aircraft by picking or lowering our nose, how we exposing our rotor blade, which essentially speaking is now a parachute, is going to help us maintain the rotor RPM in a specific configuration in order to allow us to have a soft landing at the bottom. I think the best way to visualize this is that at altitude, let's say in safe altitude of 500 to 700 feet above the ground, that we have three buckets. The three buckets that we have a proper RPM, right, over 102, at 102 to 104%, that we have at least 1,000 feet in this particular case of altitude, and that we have a forward speed of at least 65 knots. If something happens at that point in time, we know the immediate actions if the engine quits, that we have to lower the collective left pedal aft pressure. So lower the collective by taking out the angle of attack of the blade. Right now we're going from top down to bottom up flow. So that allows us, to be able to use the rotor system, essentially speaking, as a parachute. The second part is by maintaining forward speed, right? That creates lift over the airfoil itself, and then we have making sure that we have maintained a rotor RPM as we take the collective all the way down. Sometimes we have to bump it back up to prevent any overspeed on the rotor itself, right? When you pull slightly aft, the wind from the bottom up will end up increasing the speed, or maintaining, hopefully, or increasing the speed of the rotor. If that happens, if it overspeeds, that's also not good, right? It becomes less efficient over time. And as you are descending, you're really trading off altitude to maintain the rotor RPM, and while we maintain the speed. But at some point in time, as we go through this transition, as you can see on the third one down, is where we are losing altitude. So we no longer have altitude to trade off here anymore. We're in that 40 to 60 feet above the ground. In order to be able to maintain the rotor RPM, we have to apply aft pressure while we still have the forward speed itself. As we're bleeding off forward speed, we are increasing or maintaining the rotor RPM itself. And at some point in time, we're going to be running out of speed. And as we start to run out of speed, we want to level the aircraft, and then we want to pull collective in order to have the softest possible landing. At that point in time, when you are less than 8 feet above the ground, as your rotor RPM decays, you are going to be settling on the ground at a safe speed and altitude that it becomes survivable. This is the key to flight that we need to learn throughout the entire program, right? It's really about that energy management itself. So a lesser form is that if we are flying along and we always see an audible and visual that tells us that our rotor RPM is now below 97%, right? So it is, we want to always scan, right? And if something happens, we can have a left jaw, yaw of the nose if there's rotor RPM decay, right, requiring right pedal input. We can see that the vertical speed indicator is dropping. In other words, we're losing altitude because we're not creating as much lift. And the light will come on at 97 or below. We can hear because the horn is supposed to go off at the same time. And then we can feel it, and we can actually feel the vibration. We can hear the engine change pitch as well. So again, here we want to make sure that we immediately lower the collective. We don't have to go all the way to the ground, but lower the collective. We're taking a little bit of the pitch out of the blade itself. There will be less resistance, so it'll be easier for the RPM to pick up again. We grab the throttle and we slowly bring it up. Again, we have to protect it here, even though we have, for overspeed, small movements in rolling away to your fingers, rolling away. Not to, always remember to do your thumb. The careful part of it is, of course, that we are, and as teachers, we have to have our hands on that the student doesn't accidentally roll to the thumb or even lower the throttle, which could lead to the next phase, which is really the rotor blade stall, which is very, very dangerous, right? Is that if we have a blade stall, in other words, that means that the rotor is going at such a low speed that it no longer can support the aircraft, and it will start literally dropping out of the sky. And the numbers that we have to remember here is that it is 80% of rotor RPM plus 1% per 1,000 feet of density altitude. In density altitude, what does the aircraft feel like the air is flying in today for today's weather conditions itself? So at 97, we get the alarm. We can load the collective and roll on. If it gets all the way to 80 or let's say 84, we're at 4,000 feet density altitude, we know that if we get to that particular point, we are going to be in trouble, right? So we always should know the factors that could lead to this. So if we are very high power settings and we are at or near the total weight limits or exceed the limits of our weight and balance, which is not a great thing, of course, ever to fly. It's a bad decision made right there. It makes us easy to get to this point and certainly much harder to recover from that. Right, so we should never allow an aircraft to get into this particular configuration by picking it up as quickly as possible as soon as you see the light and hear the horn, or you hear the sound difference from above you, or you have the left yaw on your nose itself. And then the last part here is very specific to the Robinson design, because they have what we call an overslung rotor head, which was designed to help with the aerodynamics, but it also has a negative downstream, is that we need to make sure that we don't cause what we call a pushover or a low G event. As a fixed wing pilot myself, one of the things we learn if you had a near stall, you push the yoke forward, right? You add more power, and then you slowly pull back and level off and reset the power setting in order to maintain level of flight with the least amount of altitude loss. Well, in a helicopter, you cannot do that. If you're at a zero speed at 2,500 feet and the engine quits, if we just push over the cyclic strong forward, we can actually create what we call a low G or less than less G effect. You're floating in that could lead to what we call a mast bumping, which is not it could be detrimental to the aircraft itself. So the caution here is that we need to do things very carefully with small movements, no large movements, and certainly no movements that would cause a push over or a low G event itself. So it is something that can happen in a normal flight, right? When we hold the blades and the weight of the fuselage and cause them to move in unison, right? It's supposed to be together. When we have a low G effect, essentially speaking, both are floating, and it can be a separation of the body versus the rotor itself. And this effect, when we feel this way, we can cause that trouble we talked about, but lead to mast bumping. Right, and the mast bumping can lead to actually cutting off the tail of the aircraft itself. So the word of caution here is, of course, is that if you maintain controlled flight and you're maintaining good rotor RPM and good forward speed and proper altitude, and you manage your energy appropriately at all times, there's never a reason to get into this. But if for some reason you get into a point that you have a low speed event, like even in vortex ring state or settling with power, we don't want to ever yank the cyclic forward or doing a pushover, which can cause that phenomenon of the body being separated from the rotor blade itself, which could cause mass bumping. In other words, reading its outer limit in the underslung, and when it rotates to the back, that it could actually take out the tail. If you don't believe me, go online. There are plenty of examples of that on what could happen, and this is real stuff, and it leads to obviously death. The key here for the student is to have an endorsement in their book, both for the 22 and 44. It needs to be certified by a CFI. Obviously, there's components of this or advanced training for auto rotation. It talks about the manipulation of engine and rotor RPM, as we covered today, low rotor RPM and the effects of low G and mast bumping. And of course, the key here is proper recovery procedures, as we discussed. In order to be able to fly solo, there's a minimum hour requirement of 20 hours of dual instruction. That's a requirement. So that's not an option, that's a requirement, including the endorsement before the person is allowed to go solo. For both the R22 and R44, if you're less than 200 hours, this has to be an annual requirement. If you're over 200 hours, then you can do it on a biannual basis, part of your biannual flight review. And there's no difference here between the 22 and 44. The endorsement of the flight instructor, before the flight instructor may provide this instruction or conduct flight review, they must have 200 hours in helicopters, of which 50 hours in the R22 or R44. To teach and conduct a flight review, right? To obtain the endorsement from an authorized DPE and FAA inspector for each type, right? And demonstrate the ability to teach the awareness and flight training stated in the SFAR 73. Flight review we covered over here, and then of course, the currency we covered as well. Of course, overall currency, anytime we're flying in a helicopter, according to 61.57, we need to have 3 takeoff and landings in the preceding 90 days in order to carry passengers during daytime hours, or at nighttime it needs to be a full stop in order to be able to meet your requirements. And that is an annual or biannual flight review as appropriate. All right, with that said, we can transition to our weather services. So now that we have had basic training in our R44 and have been signed up and received our endorsement, we looked at our aeronautical decision making. We made the right decision to go out on the flight. This is a go up to this point in time, but we have one more step to go. We want to dive even deeper into the weather services. Now that we have talked a lot, things could have changed. So we want to pick up a little bit more information. So as you know, there is a ton of weather information readily available at your fingertips. I always say, I can study this until the cows come home. I am not a meteorologist. So I can, follow my instincts based on, hundreds of hours of experience of flying, or I can really, and as I should, rely on the expertise of experts out there. Right. So yes, I can listen to ADIS or ASOS or AWOS. Yes, I can read and interpret a for-flight briefing where they literally clearly label things in green and blue and red for the route of flight itself. But nothing substitutes for picking up 1-800-WX brief and speaking to somebody and getting a report. So I say that right up front, and I think we're going to demonstrate it in the back end today, before we go out to flying, to actually pick up the phone and have a quick conversation about our make pretend trip from Stewart to Albany and get an outlook or a condensed version in order to make the right decision just before I go flying, if it is safe to fly or not. So knowing what the weather is doing on the surface is the first step to getting up in the air. Right? Just because it looks really good here doesn't mean it looks good at the airport. It certainly doesn't mean it looks good at the airport where you're going. Right? It is a lot of factors come into play that we have to be very sensitive and be very mindful about that. Now, of course, that with technology rapidly changing around us, and more reliance on satellite imagery and balloons and all kinds of other inputs, uh, we have to still be mindful that we are working with a bunch of different resources that is left up to interpretation. But we're going to go over real quick on some area of systems that you should be aware of. So first is radar, right? You can see that, and they're usually the indicator you see them on top of ships, on top of buildings, or on top of mountains, right? They detect the movement and the intensity of the precipitation. Radar is updated every hour. One of the biggest things you have to remember with radar is when you're looking at a radar image, it's already about 15 minutes old. Right? But it really gives you a clear indication of the precipitation that's heading in your direction, how fast it is coming at your direction, and always imagine it to be a little bit further than where you see it on the image that you see, because it's that 15-minute lag that is in there. It does not mean that what you see is actually hitting the ground, right? There's a system there, but it doesn't tell you what kind, and including, for example, would not be able to give you a hail, right? The weather conditions can be primed for that. They can be reported on it, but it might not tell you exactly what kind of precipitation you have. Our satellite observations, and obviously we have lots of satellites up above us circling the Earth at this point in time. And of course, that's getting better, giving us a really comprehensive full picture of that with visible imagery, right? And we can go on in our full flight, we can look at, current, we can look at, projected in 6 hours and 12 hours and 18 hours and 24 hours. And all of these things can tell part of the story. What does it look like today or now? What does it look like in time? And of course, that's especially important as you start flight planning for yourself. So here, for example, under the collection of weather, you have visual, you have infrared, you have water vapor. We have other types of sensors that can record and all kinds of upper winds and rainfall and life cycles of storms. And the images can be found on the internet by for example, at NOAA. A lot of these imaging are used by ForeFlight as they provide you a weather brief as well. So let's go back to some of the older system, but still reliable. These are service weather advisories at the airport, most likely, like we use Orange County, where you have an automated weather reporting system, AWOS, that you can actually make a phone call into, or you can get it onto, via the radio frequency to get, a reading of what it is like on the field at the moment, and that's updated continuously. ASOS is the automated service observation system, more widely used, and is a bit newer, and it's used the same way, but it can provide additional information, and AWOS might not always have that available to you. So weather data collection, here's it broken down. The key here is that if you're flying in a controlled airspace, like a Class D or C or B, you will have to listen to ATIS in order to enter. This information is updated on an hourly basis or on an as needed if there's not a sudden change. It's always recorded locally, and there's an alpha number to it to be able to indicate how old the information is, or you have to let the air traffic controller know that you have listened to the latest information, I should say. ATIS is most comprehensive, and it's available only at Howard Airport itself. AWOS and ASOS, you will see at different levels at different airports, but it's not a requirement for non-controlled airspaces. It all depends, of course, if they have any money. The upper air weather, now, of course, in flying high altitude for helicopters is really not that big of a deal, but we should certainly look at weather conditions between 0 and 6,000 feet, which is about normal for us to fly between 0 and 6,000 AGL. Again, other ways of collecting information is through balloons and all kinds of different equipment. It provides you, with information, especially along the jet stream, on what is coming our way and what we can anticipate. It's really how you bring all of the information together and making a sensible picture of what is the flight going to be like today. Am I ready to conduct this flight in a safe manner, and come back as well? The current weather is knowing where to get current weather information is important for every flight. A big part of the go no go decision, right? It's really the last piece of the puzzle before you go. We talked about the ATIS. We talked about another system called METARS. It is meteorological aerodrome reports. The current weather observation given about every 53 minutes, and some of it can come coded. Now, interesting enough, on ForeFlight, you can get it coded, or you can get it in plain English language, which allows you to understand it a little bit better. For the purpose of the exam, we still need to learn how to interpret that. So here's a guide for that. Obviously, it always starts off with an identifier and a date and time of the notification itself. Will then give you the direction of the wind speed, and the visibility. It will then give you an indication of what the cloud situation is. Here, few clouds at 4,300 feet. Then it will give you a temperature dew point, 26/16, and then an altimeter reading at 300 or 30.07. Then you will have a temperature dew point that is a temperature differential of 2 with any standard type of remarks. Again, it is easily to read in a more standard format on ForeFlight, so you don't have to interpret this on the fly. Because in the exam, you still need to be able to read it in a coded format. But to make it easier for the pilot to really make sure that we don't make any mistakes, today you have it interpreted for you. You can read it for yourself. It takes a bit of practice. Getting PIREPs en route, again, that's in a format that they ask you to follow location, time, the altitude, the flight level, what kind of aircraft you are flying. Talk about the type of sky cover, the flight visibility, the weather, the temperature, and then the winds aloft. The key here is really to provide other pilots in the same type of aircraft and the same altitude of any things that of concern, like moderate to severe turbulence or icing conditions en route. All right. The weather depiction charts, the detailed service conditions derived from METARs and other service observations. Here we can look at service analysis charts of finding where we have high and low pressures or occluded. Of course, simply stated, in high pressure tends to be nicer weather. Well, if you have a low pressure, that can bring some more concerns. We can at a quick look at the isobars and see how far they are apart. The further apart, the easier, the lighter the winds are, the tighter they are packed, the higher the winds and the disturbances are. This is a pressure analysis chart to take a look at both the wind speed and directions. And we know that the difference in direction between a low pressure and a high pressure system can cause. And then it's looking at forecast, right? What does it look like in the near future? The near future is really defined by you, depending on the flight that's going to take place. And you should really have the weather conditions for the point of arrival for at least 2 hours post. So you have your cover appropriately. An area forecast will give a general weather info for a particular area. And we're going to demonstrate that later in the program. We are going to call 1-800-WEATHER BRIEF to get an area forecast for the flight between Stewart and Albany, New York. The terminal area forecast is another one. It's prediction of the surface weather. It is updated only 4 times a day at 6-hour increment. It's valid for 24 hours. It will give you the wind direction in true magnetic. And it's coded like a METAR itself to have some consistency between that. Again, in ForeFlight, you can ask for just an English readout of that to help you understand. The winds aloft will allow us to make better decisions depending on the direction, the speed, and the temperature. Again, since we as helicopter pilots don't fly too high too often, it's less important. But I think it is important to understand that you have friction of wind can take place at the surface level, while 2,000 feet it can be pointing in a whole different direction. So always be aware and look for indicators as you fly on the ground, like flags, smoke, and ripples on water, to allow you to see what is taking place on the ground level versus 2,000 feet or up itself. All right, so these are just a bunch of other weather reports. There's an example here of looking at the flags to estimate the wind direction and the wind speed itself. Then we have a significant weather prognostic charts that help you identify if there's any kind of systems, right, forecast that can help you in flight planning itself. It's valid from the service to 24,000 feet. It's issued 4 times a day at both 12 and 24-hour charts. Again, helicopter flying, because we often tend to be very local, this is less of a concern. But certainly you want to be able to see if there's any low visibility, ceiling issues, or turbulence in your particular area, because that will be a good way to make a no-go decision if you have any of these into play. The service prognostic charts, they're issued daily. Again, you can look at them for 12, 24, 36, or 48 hours. It helps you, start planning process. Also make a decision that I might want to wait for a storm to come through before I go into, before I make a final decision to fly or not to fly. Again, remember that on the leading edge of a cold front, we can have very turbulent conditions that can have poor visibility, high winds, and other type of negative impact on our flight conditions itself. The convective outlook is the general outlook of thunderstorms activities. This is, of course, important that, as a helicopter pilot, we don't want to come within 20 miles of any thunderstorm. The anvil could hold all kinds of surprises that could be detrimental to flight. Beautiful thing of flying the helicopters, of course, if you come into convective weather circumstances, you can always land off-field and wait the storm out rather than trying to outrun it, which is sometimes very difficult to do. Look out for advisories. Again, I think the key here is that having a conversation with other pilots when you're not sure, looking at weather reports together, and picking up the phone and call 1-800-weather brief is going to be your strongest attribute to be able to make the right decisions. What you don't want to run into is in category Sierra, by IFR conditions. You don't want to get into anything more than light turbulence for a sustained period of time. Again, Tango is moderate turbulence with low-level wind shear and winds more than 30 knots. Again, if you're a less than 200-hour pilot, that is not an area that you want to play in. And Zulu, meaning looking at freezing levels and moderate icing. Again, icing and helicopter flying are incompatible unless you have an aircraft that's properly prepared for that. SIGMETs are valid for 4 hours. Convective SIGMETs are valid for only 2 hours. You can see the significance of that, right? One is an advisory for all aircraft, while the other one is truly in hazardous situation with embedded thunderstorms as well as hail, which can be very much, very detrimental to flying. The last piece of the puzzle is we always should check out our NOTAMs. Our NOTAM D is for distance, covering the information about other airports and facilities. The NOTAM FDC is Flight Data Center, is more regulatory in nature, but here the key is it includes any updated TFRs. If you use for flight, these TFRs will appear in red circles around locations or cities. And remember, do not fly through that unless you have special permission to do so. We have a NOTAM GPS for occasion that there are dark spots or lack of service, but the number of satellites out there becomes less and less of a case, of course. And then, of course, you have a NOTAM M, which is more military base. All right, we're going to forego this piece as we're going to do that in our simulation later on by calling 1-800-weather brief. They're going to update before we go out flying. Know that you can find lots of good weather information. One good resource for us is the aviationweather.gov, which is FAA approved. The other one is for flight. You can actually file a plan and get a full briefing of the plan covering all of the topics we talked about over the last 20 minutes in order to be able to make a really solid go, no, go decision. And I love the fact that it is also colorimetric. There's also an HEMS report or a medical helicopter report that you can get. And again, there are lots of resources available to you in order to get that. Today, we're going to be looking for an Outlook briefing from our 1-800 weather briefing, and that will be done at the back end of the program. The conclusion is, make a really good decision, right? Now that we, at the end of that, it is that, are we ready to fly? Is the pilot ready? Is the aircraft ready? Is the environment set and conducive to it? Are there any external pressures at play that prevents us from having a safe flight itself? So we're going to take a break here, and then we're going to obviously ask the student, the DPE here, to take take a little walk around and stretch the legs and relax before we go into our next subject areas. And I'll toggle back here quick to my document that I laid out. Is that we go from our PAVE checklist that I laid out in a way that it gives me some guidance that we want to go into the helicopter aerodynamics. Here, I'm going to provide an opportunity to look at 3 different areas. Obviously, we can't cover all of them. One of my layout items here is that I provide each of these, for example, translational lift. I gave a short descriptive. I want to be laid out how I want to be able to explain that. Right, so here in this sense that the definition of translational lift refers to the additional lift a helicopter experiences in transactions from hover to forward flight. In a hover, the rotor system encounters its own downwires, which recirculates through the rotor blades, reducing the efficiency. Right, these are the vortexes that turn in on itself, and what the blades really want is clean air. Only way to get that is by going in a forward action. Why greater lift in forward flight? In forward flight, the helicopter moves through the undisturbed air and the rotor blades operate more efficiently, generating more lift. This improvement is due to the decreased impact of the rotor wash on both the main rotor and the tail rotor, right? Everything becomes more effective as we go through that process. So how will we teach something like this? Well, to the student, we can emphasize that is the helicopter gains airspeed, typically above the 10 to 15 knots at translational lift. That the rotor system exits the recirculated air, increasing lift without an increase of power. And we can draw this on the board to show what that looks like, and we can show the difference when we go from translational lift into effective translational lift when we are clearing it all together by just increasing the speed to 16 to 24 knots itself. Now you can see here the QR codes that I put into it. You can actually scan these, and if your student requires a more visual reference, and these are helicopter lessons in less than 10 minutes by Jake, which I find to be very, very functional and very informative. It gives the person a much deeper understanding of what that looks like, and he is a very good artist over top of that. We have topics of the symmetry of lift, settling of power, and then auto rotation. We did the auto rotation already, so we'll skip that. But I certainly, we can have a discussion. So here I provided some basic information in the handout itself for visual references. So either we can take these and bring it to the whiteboard and draw them into the different phases, or we can talk about it in greater details. So with that said, we can go back to the basics and advanced aerodynamics. Since my goal is to fill up about 2 hours, we're about a little over an hour into it. We might as well continue to go and see how it all works. Right, that's the goal of this mock session, to be able to explain my way through this with a certain level of competency. Again, in our regular lesson plan during the Checkride, I'm going to ask the DPE or the student to tell me where they want to focus in on. For the purpose today, I'll just cover most of the area. But from a time-consuming, time perspective, I'm sure there's not time to go through the entire deck for both basic and advanced aerodynamics. Funny thing, of course, one of the basic questions, is the wing the same as a rotor? Essentially speaking, it is, right? It is that it has a similar symmetrical shape to it, and they both are in charge of creating lift for the aircraft itself. So in our aircraft, we will see symmetrical and asymmetrical setups of the rotor blade itself. There's often a difference between the symmetry of of that in the helicopter, of the main rotor and the tail rotor. So for us, the main rotor is asymmetrical, while the tail rotor is asymmetrical itself. The airfoil, therefore, is the surface, such as an airplane wing or rotor blade, designed to create a useful reaction through the air, which then allows it to create lift, right? Symmetrical, the main rotor, and the reason why that is when we are sitting at an hover, or we're sitting on the ground with the blade spinning, we don't want to have any lift created, right? So we want to have a zero angle of attack at that point in time. If you have a symmetrical, like we have the tail rotor as being asymmetrical, it's already giving a little bit of a counter anti-torque. So if the main blade is spinning to the left or counterclockwise, right? Newton's law states that you want to have an equal and opposite reaction. So the nose wants to go in the direction as well. Therefore, we will need to have a counter to that to making sure that our nose is pushed to the right, right? So that is really, really important piece of the puzzle. So what are the parts of an airfoil? We have a leading edge. Often in our helicopter blades, you will see them, they're covered in stainless steel. We have a trailing edge, which is the thinnest part of it. We have a short line, which is the imaginary line from the front to the back. If it is split through the middle, it's equal on top, equal on the bottom. That's a symmetrical. If it is slightly bigger on top than the bottom, you have an asymmetrical, right? And then you have the blade span, which is the length of a blade from tip to tip. Here it is, talks a little bit about the tip path plane, the circular plane made by the rotation of the path of the blade. So you have to imagine, if the rotors goes around, you go to the outer tip, and what that tip path plane will look like. That's the plane of rotation. And then the axis of rotation is the imaginary line that the rotor rotates around in a perpendicular or to the plane of rotation itself. So one of the important terms is the induced flow, is the downwash of the helicopter. It's the downwash flow of air over the rotor disc due to lift production. The tip vortices of the trailing edge and the tips of the blades push rearward and downward. Right? These are the vortexes that we have seen. Resultant relative wind is the airflow from the rotation modified by the induced flow. It separates the useful and the useless portions of the angle. The pitch angle is the angle between the short line and the tip path plane, the collective raised to a high angle. Right? That is how we manually manipulate that. The angle of attack is the angle between the short line and the resultant RW, relative wind. And then the critical angle of attack is the maximum angle of attack an airfoil can reach before clean air flow over it is disturbed and lift is then destroyed. And that is really the key when we talked a little bit about when we go too fast and we have we have feeling these vibrations when we are reaching a point where we have the separation of lamination of air. And that causes then a potential negative effect, right? We can call it causes a nose up, roll to the left type effect. All right, lift. Helicopters don't fly. They beat the air into submission. It's an interesting way of looking at it. But there are four forces at play here, right? We have to, lift needs to overcome the weight, the gravitational force, and thrust needs to overcome drag in order to be able to create flight itself. So Newton's third law is, right, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Same way as the birds fly. It's no different, and that's what we that's what we all learned it from, right? With the pitch in the blade, the air hits the bottom of the airfoil, and it's deflected downward. Because it's deflected downward, it also gives an equal and opposite reaction upward. But that's only a small component of the lift that we're experiencing, right? The lift is really created by the Bernoulli principle, where we have, and velocity increases, the pressure decreases. It's when you have that low pressure and high pressure, low pressure on top, high pressure on the bottom, which then creates the lift for us to be able to have flight itself. And it is when we create the angle of attack, right, from flat to increasing, where the molecules of air on the top need to run faster than the ones on the bottom in order to meet up on the trailing edge again, which creates that pressure differential. And I can demonstrate this here now with a piece of paper. That if you have a piece of paper, for example, here is that we can do a very simple demonstration of this. If you have a piece of paper, you hold it out straight, and you blow underneath it, it goes up. But if you make the angle of the blade, for example, and now you blow on top, you can see you're creating what we are showing here on the screen, this high and low pressure, which causes lift. And that's the principle. If you increase the angle of attack to such extreme where the air can no longer keep up, and that's where you have the separation. And you see that in the third picture over there, where then you have a loss of lift component, which is, now we have a lift equation over here. We're not going to go into that in any great detail, unless you want to learn more. But I think this is something we're going to skip. The second component, of course, is drag. We have drag that comes in different profiles. We have a profile drag, that is the friction resistance of the blade passing through the air itself. It's made up of form, and if you can see from the graph on the right hand side, that profile drag increases as we increase speed. Induced drag, think about these vortices, will decrease as speed increases itself, right? Because we're getting into cleaner air, they become less of a factor. However, parasite drag is created by all of the non-lifting components. As we increase speed, it exponentially increases drag on the aircraft itself, right? Of course, if you calculate all of these, then you come up with total drag, and total drag of all three forces, right? And that's where the drag curve shows how each type of drag changes with airspeed increase. And then you can calculate the minimum drag and maximum lift component of that. And that's in the total drag, or the red line on top. In this particular case, it would be at 53 knots and 55 knots, right? There's a drag equation. Again, we're not going to go into the mathematics here because we have too many other things. We have to think about the helicopter along its three axes: the pitch, the roll, and the yaw. When you think about our rotor systems, we have really three types of. We have rigid, semi-rigid, and articulated. The articulated, often you will see them in a blade system that has three blades. Could have four blades, but three blades, like the A-Star, is something that comes to mind. Our semi-rigid system that we think of would be the Robinson R22 and R44, while the more rigid one could be the Bell 105, which the demonstration. It also has a titanium head in it that you can see on the more expensive helicopters. The Eurocopters 135, 145 also have them. The cool thing is that you have a flapping of one blade. This is done in compensation for the symmetry of lift, We have the teetering that is no different than the bolt blades go up and down. And then we have feathering, changing the pitch angle of the rotor blades by rotating them. This is allowing the airfoil to change the pitch angle. And then we have lead and leg, which is really meant for the, which really is only for the articulated blade system itself. There's a forward and backward movement of that. I think we have discussed all that. Vibrations, we can have throughout the system itself. Low level vibrations often come out of the main rotor, medium out of the engine, high out of the tail rotor. Again, if you have many hours in the aircraft, you can probably pick that up a little bit easily. And somebody who's a bit of new to this, but certainly we can feel vibrations at startup or when we're sitting on the ground itself. That's what we have to be very mindful that we don't get into ground resonance or harmonic resonance. Both of them can be detrimental to the aircraft itself. The quicker we can pick that up to be able to stop it, it's either by shutting down or actually by picking up. By increasing collective and getting into the air. As soon as we get into the air, that could save the aircraft itself. But there's some really cool pictures on YouTube if you want to go type it in, harmonic or resonance, and you'll see what can actually happen to the helicopter. And truly, within seconds, they can fall apart and shake you, essentially speaking, to death. Like the portion of the more advanced aerodynamics, be it where that comes into play when we are starting to hover, we're picking up and we start going into flight itself. We can talk about a bunch of different components of that. I always find this an interesting pictures, that hovering over water. The question is that the same as we hover over blacktop or concrete or high grass or water? The answer is it requires a different power setting for depending on where you're hovering over top, or the different types of surfaces you hover over top of. And that's in ground effect, of course. It all comes down to the efficiency. So again, the four forces that we have to play with is lift and weight, and thrust and drag itself. Taking these into account, we have to really think about the torque that is being created by the rotation, the counterclockwise rotation of the blade itself. That is for American-based helicopters. In Europe, most of the blades will be going clockwise. So everything we say here will be the direct opposite. I will say that for myself, this took a little bit of time to really get to start understanding on all of these dynamics that were taking place, right? Is that, what does really torque mean? How does it really work? Why am I drifting to the right? Why is my rotor head actually, slightly tilted to be able to not, prevent my drifting to the right towards the thrust of the tail rotor itself? But all these things, these concepts, that as you start flying itself and start working with your students, is to experience these things, right? To really talk about them one component at a time, to allow them to understand on why that is taking place. And you can do that through visualization, both by talking about it, by drawing pictures on how the aircraft is moving through the air, translational lift and effective translational lift into a steady state forward motion. These are all very important pieces of flight itself, and you have to take your time. Of course, the interesting part is it all starts with a hover, right? As we pick up the aircraft, we increase power setting, we increase the angle of attack of our blades. We start chopping more air to the point that we can become weightless. In other words, we start lifting off the ground itself. That we're going to an in-ground hover. Right there, lots of things are changing, right? And one of the things that we will experience is that we will start feeling that there's a slight drift to the right in the direction of the thrust of the helicopter tail rotor, right? The tail rotor wash is going to the right, is going to the right, it is being pushed to the opposite direction. And obviously we have to slightly offset. Now, the R-44, the main rotor is slightly rigged already to prevent that drift to the right, but you might need to have a little bit more left cyclic in order to be able to overcome that itself. Again, it takes a long time to get that right feeling, right? Why is it that the right skid picks up before the left? Why is it that I'm drifting to the right initially? And again, these things will start making a whole lot more sense once you are doing them in flight and you start pointing them out and you allow those things to take place without making any corrections. It often will lead to a deeper understanding of the by the student itself. As a big guy, right? I'm 275 pounds. I'm sitting as a CFI. I'm sitting on the left. The main tank is on the left. So if there's lots of fuel and lots of weight on the left-hand side, it's only natural that the right skid would pick up first. But that's really not just a case of having the right, having a heavier person on the left or fuel, right? There are other phenomenons that are at play here. Is that when in and hover, the left skid will hang low as well as being the last to pick up and the first to sit down itself. Is the coupling of the force. The main rotor is higher than the tail rotor and hanging the left side low. The plane of the rotation of the tail rotor is lower than the main rotor, causing a slight fuselage roll itself. Would be opposite if the main rotor is turned clockwise. More weight in the left seat would exaggerate. And that's my point, is that when I'm in the left seat, this can become a little bit worse. So how do we correct that? Well, as we are starting to create lift, we just need to have a little bit more right cyclic so we can wait until the total lift component is in play and we can come up straight, or we make small adjustments as we go into an in-ground effect hover. So here the difference is that we have to remember that in-ground versus out-of-ground. In-ground is more efficient, takes lower power setting, but there are other pieces of the puzzle that we need to take into account. And hovering is a very interesting concept, right? Is that it takes quite a bit of power in order to maintain that. And here too, you have some really good visuals. So on the right-hand side, I think is really the key to remember. We talked about Newton's third law, that everything is an equal and opposite reaction. So in this particular case, you can see the inflow of the air from top to bottom. You see that the vortices are turning on itself on the tips of the wing. So there's a little lift created over there. But as the air is compressed below the helicopter, something is also pushing it back up. Right, and that's what we talked about earlier with surface. If you have to do it on concrete, grass, or water, the softer the surface is, the more the less of an effect that you get out of that. Of course, the less of an effect that requires more power to stay, to stay in a hover. So it's part of the reason why we do a two-stage pickup, is that we first pick up to about 2 to 3 feet, so it takes max effect. A long time ago, somebody used that, they call it the barn door effect, right? Is that you stay in the 2-foot hover. Same thing as you go out to an IFR flight, you do all your pre-checks, or we call the wiggles, at 2 to 3 feet off the ground itself. Or you're waiting for this max compression, that if you're on a warm day and want to go flying and you want to use the least amount of power, you want to stay as low as possible to the ground, have this compression before you start applying max power and forward motion in order to get the max lift component out of you and lift performance out of your aircraft itself. Because when you look at the influx of air from top to bottom, now that we're out of ground about 15 feet at the length of a blade, this becomes less efficient. So therefore, we need more power in order to be able to hover at altitude. Now, this doesn't make a difference if it's at 15 feet or at 1,500 feet. This holds true, right? And that's why it is dangerous to do for any length of time. And we need to know what our max continuous RPMs is, or manifold pressure is, in order to not overstress the helicopter and cause potential detrimental outcome. All right, as soon as we start, going from a hovering and stable that we want to be able to say, okay, we want to move forward, and forward again is tipping it, the rotor into the wind a little bit. As the wind comes from top down, we're changing the lift component and the resultant. But also, of course, it helps us by having a more efficient creation of lift. So we can provide lift at a lower continuous power setting, which is, of course, key. And then here we have the ability to go left, and we go right, and we go forward, and we go backwards. It all depends on how we're going to change our cyclic. With that, The pendular action, the reason why we talk about this is that we want, during the phase of teaching a new student how to hover, often this phenomenon will take place, right? It is the ability to oscillate 360 degrees, right? It's like tire swing moves in all directions, and often seen with the first initiation of learning how to hover. And this really comes all from drastic movements, right? The teaching of hovering is done in a three-step approach. First, the cyclic, then the collective, then having your feet on the pedals itself and manipulate them. The key thing is that you don't want the student to be able to make more, movements than absolutely necessary. But it's only human nature, right? When you start flying a helicopter, when you go left, you want to go right, and instead of going back to neutral, they go right past neutral, and then you start having that swing. As the CFI, you do need to know when to intervene so the aircraft does not get out of control. This always should be done at a safe distance above the ground so you don't lose altitude at the same time as you are on this pendular swing itself. Again, firmly holding the cyclic in its neutral position will slow that down. The best way to fix it, if nothing works, is to resume forward flight, and it will straighten it out pretty quick itself. The key is to be patient. The key is to have smooth actions, minimal movements, making sure the eyeballs are outside and not inside, and certainly not at the feet or at the ground near the feet itself. And you need to start anticipating the corrections. And I will tell you, right, as a student, listen, that might take an hour, that might take 5 hours, it might take 10 hours. But learning how to anticipate is not as easy as it sounds. But it would be very, very helpful. And there's some techniques we can discuss on how to do this at home. By taking a bottle of soda, take the cap off it, put a pencil in it, hold it in your finger, index finger and thumb, and just allow yourself the movement in the bottle without touching the side of this bottleneck. Right, and this bottleneck is not that big. If you want to start off with in a larger, wider amount, that's fine. But bring it back down, because if you think about the amount of movement in a helicopter, is often no bigger than the neck of a soda bottle itself. And the quicker the student grasps that, the easier it is for them to get through this particular phase of a lot of self-doubt. Right? You'll see people getting very, very frustrated. Again, the way to overcome that is go have fun, fly around, and don't practice hovering for an hour at a time. By 10 hours, most people will figure out how to learn how to hover. And once you overcome that, I think flying becomes a whole lot more fun and less stressful itself. One of the things that we have to always be mindful about is the dynamic rollover, and we're going to use a very straightforward anything slope more than 5 degrees is something that we need to be mindful about, that we can cause what we call a static or dynamic rollover. A static rollover is when the center of gravity goes outside of the skid, while the dynamic rollover is more when you are stuck on one skid and you're moving in that direction of the stuck skid. The key thing is to stop the movement in that direction and lower the collective, and hoping that you will flop back onto both skids with no angle of attack in the blades itself, and be able to recover from that. That's why when you do your pickup of locations, both in grass or wetlands, or for that matter, even on a tarmac with some where there's some new tar applied, or on a hot summer day where the tar might be soft, you want to test this out before any making abrupt movement. So part of teaching takeoffs is to be very, very slow and methodical. You can become quicker at it over time, but you want to be able to pick up as slowly as possible, so you have less chance of getting one skid being stuck and having to overcorrecting that can lead to that outcome. I think one of the most difficult concepts of flight itself is the gyroscopic precession that has taken place. So I think the concept of being able to discuss with your student that an input in a blade for, let's say, at 3 o'clock is not felt until 90 degrees later. Now, the good thing is that when they made the helicopter, they made some mechanical changes knowing this. So that way it was corrected when you put an input into your cyclic forward. It's actually, the rotor is tipping down and you go forward, or you go left, you go right, you go backwards. So the pitch horns are offset by 90 degrees. So even though the angle, you're pushing it forward on the blade itself, if you want to go forward, it's the input is done at the 90 degrees previous to that. You can see this a little bit when you are, at the aircraft and you and work the cyclic, and the student can look at the blades itself and how things are being moved around. There's some great examples of a very close-ups online on how this is actually, proceeding. The key to remember is that this is corrected by the pitch change horn on the helicopter itself, but that is not the case when the input is in flight. So if you have a sudden wind gust coming at you, a change of direction or speed that hits you right on the nose, that does not mean that you're necessarily going to go pitch up. Right? That input is felt, is at 12 o'clock, but is then felt at 9 o'clock. Right? That could cause a sudden turn to the right or turn to the left, depending on what takes place. So always remember that in flight itself, the controls are offset, but anything that happens outside of the flight still has that precession component to it, and that is something you have to take into account in order to be able to properly counteract that. Right. All right, the four forces, we have talked about that: lift versus weight, thrust versus drag, and a total rotor thrust, in order to be able to have forward motion. One of the phenomenons with our system is that you have a coning of the blade that takes place. That is on both sides. We'll do that simultaneously. As you go into and hover itself, you'll see some coning, and it very much depends on the type of system that you have. Are these articulated, are these rigid or semi-rigid? But in our semi-rigid system, it is more visible. As you start, generating lift itself, initially the blades will bend slightly upwards, it will then help you create lift. Now, the problem is if you are too heavy, there is a point that you go to an extreme where you will not be able to create lift enough to be able to get off the ground itself. Of course, other outside factors that come into play, if there's a high, hot, and heavy, you might run into problems with the coning, right, of that. So you have to be mindful. It's the centrifugal forces, right, that are outward from the rotor hub when the blades are moving. Is no different than when you think about the ballerina, right? Is that if the ballerina has the arms stretched out versus the arms right next to it, it becomes so the bringing the blades up or bringing it closer to the center allow it to go faster and creating more lift to a certain component of that, right? The Coriolis effect is the tendency of the rotor blades to change its RPMs when the center of mass moves closer or further from the center of the rotation, right? You can see that if you have increased coning in picture A or lower coning in picture number B, right? So if you have A, it is increasing, right? And as it stretches out, it elongates, it decreases. So the governor, right, tries to regulate that. Is that Coriolis is not the problem, because the governor picks that up and maintains between 101 and 104% during the hover itself, right? The blade flapping is equal on both sides, equal in order to be able to have and to hover with great effect. And that's where we talk about the symmetry of lift in a few minutes of that itself too. Part of the problem here is that in forward flight, the advancing and retreating tendency changes with the flapping motion, right? We flap up to reduce the angular attack on the advancing blade, and we flap down on the retreating blade side. The governor can't be constantly chasing this, so we have to compensate. The down flapping blade doesn't speed up because it doesn't pass the point of center of mass, gets closer to that of the mast itself. Right, that's what we just talked about. Is that the RPM does not change at that particular point in time. The stages of the takeoff that we go through, and is that initially we have to understand that at zero speed, all of the air is distributed from top to bottom. In ground effect, remember we had that little bit of what we call that barn door effect, and this compression of air, making us, create enough to help us with lift. Out of ground, of course, it requires a higher power. The key thing to remember is that the vortices on the end of the tips turn on itself. So that's not, it's not for makes for efficient lift. It's only when we are going to forward flight where the vortices are being pushed backwards. So now the front of the helicopter has now clean air, which brings in a lift component, which is helpful. But you still have the negative effects on the opposite end of the blade, as well as the tail itself. Right, there's inefficiencies there. So as we go through that transverse flow effect, that 10 to 20 knots, we'll feel the difference in lift between the forward and the aft parts of the rotor. In other words, induced. It creates an unequal lift, so there's increase in vibrations. You can actually feel this. And then due to the gyroscopic precession, the increase in lift is also felt 90% later on the left, causing that right roll. And that's what the example I showed earlier. So this is no longer a cyclic input. This is an input on how the wind is interacting with the front of the blade. And by coming underneath the front, the input is on the 12 o'clock. It rotates counterclockwise in this case, 90 degrees to the 9 o'clock section, increasing lift on that particular point, causing a turn to the right. And if you closely pay attention to that, you can feel that as well, right? We can then correct this with a gentle left cyclic and gentle forward cyclic as we push, as we call that, we push our way past this. And the key thing is not to let the helicopter rise at this point. We have to push through this moment at the same level attitude in order to gain the greatest amount of efficiency, as the air inflow from the top down is going to be pushing all of the vortices behind us. And once that takes place between 16 and 24 knots, we are picking up the cleanest of air, and that's where the vibrations will stop. We'll recognize that with a little bit of a left yaw, a nose up attitude, and then we will feel that we see that the strings on the window will start coming up, from which we can see if we are properly aligned, if we need any pedal input. And as we continue to push through this all the way to 40 to 45 knots, at that point in time, we had maximum, and we can bring it to maximum power to lift up and get the maximum lift component out of it up to 55 knots. And then we can climb out at anywhere between 500 to 700, 800 feet per minute. Again, the best way to demonstrate is by feeling and doing these things rather than just sitting in an office. We can use a model here to be able to demonstrate it. We can draw it on the board, but I think there's no substitute to this than actually going onto into the aircraft, go to the airport, and actually feel these phenomena on the aircraft itself as we go from sitting on the ground to an hover in ground effect to tipping forward, and then going through the different stages as you feel the vibrations, the pushes to the right, etc., etc. And this takes many flights to really make a whole lot of sense out of that. All right, so this is a good demonstration over here. It's a visualization of what that looks like at the different stages of stationary to translational lift, to transverse flow, to effective translational lift, to overcoming the parasite drag, reducing the performance, whether that's the profile and the parasite, and then the retreating blade stall when you're going when you go too fast. We talked about that It happens at 130 knots, or if higher winds or higher weight, that happens at a lower point itself. Here it is just a matter of slowing down the aircraft in order to be able to get to it. All right, the symmetry of lift. Do we have a speed limit in our helicopters? The answer is yes. This is one of the reasons why, because the symmetry of lift, there's a component that one blade is, of course, going forward while the other blade is going backwards. The simple equations here is that on the advancing blade on the right side of the aircraft is going into the relative wind, and you need to add these speeds together. So if it's going to go at 400 plus 100, that's 500. While on the opposite side, on the retreating blades, you have to subtract it because the blade is going backwards, right? It's retreating, so that's the trailing edge is facing forward, and it is spinning away from that. So it's 400 minus 100, and having only 300 knots of. So here we have to make, how can we, make sure that there is that there's equal lift component on both the left and the right side itself, which is now done through the flapping of the blade itself. So it's what we call a compensatory mechanism, that when the blade it goes forward, it reduces the angle, so reduce the amount of lift on the advancing side, while we increase the lift on the retreating side, therefore equaling lift across the entire rotor itself. The retreating blade stall can occur when we are going too fast. It's caused by exceeding the critical angle of attack. And again, this changes by aircraft. So you can look at the Pilot Operating Handbook on what that is. For the R-44 is at 130 knots, or change depending on weather condition itself and weight itself. But once you start exceeding the critical angle of attack in the retreating blade, we're losing lift component. As you can see in the diagram on the right-hand side, the stall area starts in two areas: one at the tip and one at the root, right at the mast itself. So the lift component on that between what is left over on that particular area is decreased. So if it decreases, right, we talked about that the input is now not internal but external. You lose lift component, so it is felt at 90 degrees later, right? And that's when you start feeling that the change in the helicopter. The key to this is to recover is to lower the collective, so we're lowering the angle of attack, and then gentle aft cycling by slowing down, and we start reloading it, and then of course maintain the speed at 90 to 100 knots, or back off by enough that you don't recreate this or recurring blade stall itself. So how can we calculate the VNE? There's a VNE chart in your Pilot Operating Handbook, and you can look at the different components. Again, the 22 and 44 are slightly different, but the calculations are made the same way, and you don't want to exceed that critical speed. Again, I fly the 44, so for me it is 130 knots is the never exceed speed limit. For that, to be able to stay out of that danger area, or depending on the weight and depending on the weather conditions, we need to lower that accordingly. The loss with tail rotor efficiency is always a concern as a helicopter pilot. It's one of those things we all know, that we cannot function without a tail rotor, a properly functioning tail rotor, to prevent us from spinning around the axis, right? So here we have the efficiency loss is really because of three different types of scenarios. We always have to be sensitive of wind coming from our left. So we want to protect the left side itself. Why is that? Because we don't want to have any interference of the wind and the vortices pushing them into our tail rotor itself. Our tail rotor needs to produce a thrust to be able to keep the nose aligned, right, with the direction of flight itself. If we are pushing, disturbed air into the rotor itself, it will become inefficient in providing the torque necessary to maintain a straight flight. So here it is when we have wind coming from our, let's say our 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock area on the left side, or if we have wind, what we call weather vaning, coming from anywhere from our 4 o'clock to 8 o'clock position, or if we have wind coming all the way on our right side from 11 o'clock to all the way down to the 7 o'clock area. All these things we have to take into consideration, and we have to be very mindful about, especially when we go into areas of low and slow speed, like a pinnacle landing or an off-field landing, with a certain wind condition that does not allow us to point the nose into the wind itself. Again, the beautiful thing about helicopter flying is that no matter what the winds are, no matter where we go, to be safe, to stay safe, we can actually do this by pointing the nose into the wind itself and take advantage of that. You can see one of my last videos I posted. We tried to go into a tight landing spot, which was not lined up with the wind direction. It was actually offset by almost 90 degrees. So even my second attempt, I came in at my base. The final was into the wind itself, but the space I needed in order to go over the trees and then safely land with those types of weather conditions did not leave me good enough of an out. So I actually made a decision of a no-go and would rather fly away with it and land at a local airport, get an Uber to go wherever I need to go, right? So we have to make those decisions on the fly all of the times. So again, what do we need to avoid? We need to avoid flights at low speeds when close to objects that may alter the clean flow over both the main and tail rotor. The tailwinds that demand high amounts of end-of-torque, left pedal, or pitch angle collective or power. Again, these are very, very insensitive. We can look at a video together of the settling with power. So you can see it was a demonstration flight done in the Swiss Alps where they sprayed a mist to really get to see what that looks like. But for the purpose of conversation over here, we have to think about and visualize that if we're going to go to altitude, let's say 2,500 feet, and we are going to do a photo flight. In other words, we're going to be hovering over a particular point. So that's an out-of-ground hover event, which will require more power and higher power setting. If we are not paying attention as we are hovering, and our wingtip vortexes, of course, are turning on us, we could get into a phenomenon where we are low speed, high power, and we're starting to settle. We're starting to lose altitude itself. And if we don't correct the loss of altitude, this becomes aggravated, and we can go from anywhere from 300 feet per minute all the way to 2,000 feet per minute. And of course, if we don't take a distinctive action, it's very, very difficult to recover from that itself. But as we start falling, instead of having air coming top down, bottom up, we will actually have a phenomenon that we have top down, bottom up at the end of the blades, while we have in center core bottom up, which is not the best way to really produce lift. As you can see with the picture over here, in the middle where you can see the vortexes are coming back into the blade itself, giving you a significant reduction in lift component at the same power setting. So the recovery is really two types. We have now become familiar with the Bouchard maneuver, where we simultaneously do right cyclic, raise collective, and left pedal. And the reason why we do that is that we want to have a minimum altitude loss without picking up any forward speed. In other words, if we're hovering over top of a spot for a photo flight and we want to maintain that, if we do that, we can literally, raise collective left pedal, right? That's the offset for the end-of-torque. And we do right cyclic. All we have to do is really sidestep it by the length of one blade in order to get into clean air, in order in undisturbed air outside of those vortices, in order to be able to generate enough lift at an appropriate power setting, stopping the descent rate, rather quickly. If we do not stay stationary on target, so to speak, what we could do is lower the collective and gain forward speed slowly. And the forward speed does not mean that we need to push over, right? We have to be careful we don't push. There's minimal input, but this will take a little bit more altitude loss to get into a stable environment. But again, if it's not important to be able to stay on point, then this is certainly a maneuver that works very well. The key thing is not to push over the cyclic, which can cause further issues that we have discussed in our SFAR 73 briefing earlier today. Again, what do we want to avoid? We want to avoid pulling more power than available on a particular day. So that think about the air density, right? Temperature, winds. We want to avoid any steep approaches with the high descent rate. So again, here is when you do a steep approach into an airport or a pinnacle, you're better off coming a little flatter in and having a short, steep descent than a prolonged, slow, steep descent. We want to avoid any kind of like approaches with tailwinds because that will push the vortexes into in front of us where we want to land, which of course disturbed air gives less of a cushion effect, right? Less efficiency. And the out of ground hovers with an established descent rate. So we want to be very mindful that we don't sink into it, even if the power setting is, we don't want to sink into our own disturbed air with this. And we can practice that together. We just don't want to over practice that. So that is the component of the basing and advanced. So in this component also is a requirement to talk about a system. So I've chosen here to talk about the pedostatic system because knowing that I will be doing the CFII in 6 to 8 weeks from now, I would rather concentrate at that point in time on really a deep dive into the GPS component and configurations and considerations for the IFR flight. So today, with the pedostatic tube being part of the basic six pack in the helicopter itself, it is something that's been started coming around and being used in 1912. And really, if you think about it, for the first I think 11, 12 years since the first Wright brothers took flight, nobody used this. And I will tell you that having flown an aircraft where I had a pedo tube failure in an airplane, not in a helicopter, again, you can fly well with reference to sounds and feelings. Of course, it's not the way to fly, but you can certainly do that, right? It is that if you can listen to the engine, you can feel and you see the tracking over ground in order to be able to, do safe flights. So I can certainly see how they did that until this became available. But having a visual indicator certainly helps. So in the helicopter itself, on the mast, we will see that we have a pedo tube and we have a static port on the side of the aircraft itself. It gives us two different types of information, right? We have three instruments that depend on this. We have our airspeed indicator, our altimeter, and our vertical speed indicator. Interesting enough, only the airspeed indicator uses the pedo tube, while all three of them uses information from the static port on that. And the static port is really a reading of pressure of the atmosphere and where we're flying, and of course that decreases as we gain altitude. The pedo tube is only accurate if you're pointing it directly in the path of flight. So if you're flying out of trim, the pedo tube will not give you an accurate reading. And actually, interesting enough, if you go to my last video that I did, we had high winds, and I was making a downwind to base turn, and I made it a bit uncoordinated. You can actually look at the airspeed indicator. The second I started making a turn, I went from 50 knots to 0 knots. Now, you and I both know flying that was not the case. But why did that happen? Well, simply if I made an uncoordinated turn and the pedo tube was no longer pointing in the direction of the flight, in other words, it was cockeyed, the information would be inaccurate, right? So that is important. All of these instruments back, the original six packs are all done with pressure differentials using wavers, right? Connected to mechanical linkages in order to be able to give you information. So a very interesting instrument, we'll start with that first, is the vertical speed indicator. That gives you a slightly delayed, indication if we are increasing or decreasing in altitude itself. And the question is always, well, if it gives me an indication that I'm climbing 500 feet per minute, is that immediate? Is that accurate? Well, there is a slight delay to that. Well, once I level off, how does that go back to zero? Well, there's actually a designed leak in the static pressure. That as the static pressure changes, right, as you increase in altitude, the pressure changes. Therefore, it shows an increase in altitude. Once you get to a particular point in time, and you maintain level, the air will leak out and stabilize for the altitude that you're on. Therefore, it shows no change, right? There's no up or down. Same thing as if you start descending and pressure increases, it will show, the mechanical function that you are descending itself. So that's what happens, and it's all done with the diaphragm inside of the instrument connected to mechanical output that you can look at look at the instrument on the front facing if you're increasing or decreasing. But the magic here is that the small little leak, if that leak does not, if that for some reason that gets clogged for any reason, obviously the instrument is no good, right? No air can escape from it, so the information receiving from that would be completely inaccurate. Now we could actually, flying with a VSI with or without. It's great to see that, but it's not all that important at the end of the day. Of course, if you look at the altimeter, I do want to know what my accurate altitude is, really for multiple reasons, right? I want to know if what altitude I am, adjusted for the pressure setting, which we do in the Coleman window. And part of that is when we're communicating with other aircraft. When I say I'm at 1,500 at a particular area, and they say at 1,500, I want to see that we are both at the same height above the ground, right? That's why it is very, very important to get accurate information here. So to make sure that we have make an adjustment in our Coleman window prior to flight, or set the pressure to the local reading, or update the reading on a regular basis. Certainly, if you fly more than 100 nautical miles from your original starting point, that you adjust it, and you can get that from your local flight service station. You can get it from ForeFlight, you can get it from ATC, or flight following, but make sure you update on a regular basis, because there could be some inaccuracy. What they say, you go from a high pressure to low pressure, look out below, right? So you have to be mindful of that. The key here is that it is directly linked to the static port. As we are increasing in altitude, right, pressure decreases, therefore altitude increases, right? So the mechanical link, as the balloon, as the waiver gets bigger, it will then correspond to the to giving a mechanical function reading on the outside of increasing or decreasing in altitude itself. Now, there's no leaking here, right? Because we're giving an accurate reading of the altitude that we're in with that. The next one is of the instrument is the airspeed indicator. Now, of course, this uses both a static as well as the pitot tube itself. Simply put, it measures the dynamic pressure, or the difference between the REM air and the static air. The REM air, what is forced into the pitot tube as we fly into the wind itself. And then the static on the side of the aircraft, which does not feel any impact for the wind itself. The measurement of the two differences allows us to give an accurate reading of the speed that we are seeing on the screen, right? That's the indicated speed. That does not mean that the speed over the ground is the same, right? There's the other factors that come into play over here. But again, there are two holes that we have to take into account on the pitot tube. We have a front-facing one where the air comes in, and there's a drainage tube on the outside. And there is some vulnerability that they could become clogged. And when they become clogged, the information that it then provides to us in the cockpit is no longer going to be accurate. And there are multiple different changes that can take place in order to be able to really understand what the information is telling us, and is it accurate? Accurate, yes or no. Now we can go into a whole side lecture here on what indicated and true airspeed and calibrated airspeed, but I assume that we covered it at a different topic already, because today is really more about the instrument itself. We have to make sure that we understand that the information provided to us is dependent on a properly functioning pitot tube and a static port. In our helicopter, there is no alternate static port. So if the static port is clogged on the side of the aircraft itself, there's no way for us to open up a second one. The second one is really the atmosphere inside of the cockpit itself, which is, of course, not as accurate as you have from the outside itself. There's a standard lapse rate that we talk about. The pressure differential is 1 inch per 1,000 feet elevation change, and that is the change that you see on your altimeter, right? And we talked about that. Making sure that you update your Colesman window, and the way to do that is by understanding what the local pressure is at your airport before departure. Whenever you make an adjustment to that, that should be somewhat accurate to what the known altitude of that particular departure point is. So, for example, at Orange County Airport, the altitude of the airport is about 370 feet. When they give you a pressure reading of 3002, and you dial that into the Colesman window, and it says it corresponds with 800 feet, then something needs to tell you that this is not accurate, right? So always be aware of what the altitude is of your airport versus the pressure setting that they're telling you about, to make sure that it's somewhat aligned to that. Again, here is a memory aid that is the most important one for this. That if we go from high to low, look out below. Right? It is from low to high, clear the sky. Less important. The key thing is we want to avoid obstacles below us. Now, the good thing is that as VFR pilots, because this is the VFR portion of the Checkride, eyeballs outside. Right? This should be less important. Although the altitude reporting of our aircraft to other aircraft is something that is important, right? If I'm saying that I'm coming into Orange County Airport at 1,500, then we all should be talking about the same 1,500 MSL, right? It is really, really important to be able to speak the same language. Therefore, the information and the aids that we have available to us all should be accurate. So here's a diagram that you can read in order to be able to assess what happens in flight if one of those if things are clogged up itself, and the function of that. Again, the good thing about helicopter flight during VFR flight, this is not so very important because you can still see that you're moving over the ground itself. This becomes critically important as when we are doing our visual scan during IFR flight, that these now become unreliable instruments. We have to be careful because in IFR flight, we cannot trust our senses as we do in VFR flight. It becomes now a big issue at hand. So we have to look at alternatives to that. Again, we will cover that in our IFR oral at the later time. So this is part of the 3 different lesson plans. Again, all of these, I would assume that the DPE at some point in time will continue to question and talk a little bit more and tease more information out of it. What can we do? What is available? Well, we can go to YouTube and show clips. We can go to the board and make drawings. We can come up with scenarios to make it more real life scenario on how these things actually work. So it's really the combination of different teaching factors, including holding a helicopter model in our hands, or going out to the aircraft to look at the flapping or the hinge or the swash blade or the pitch horn, in order to be able to make sense between what it is that we're representing in our lectures versus what we are representing with the DPE or the student itself. As we have talked a little bit about the different types of regulations, especially when it talks about endorsements and SFAR 73, this is an area that we need to review because it's a responsibility of the CFI to be able to endorse students for certain privileges during different phases of flight itself. So there's a booklet that our company has produced that clearly spells out on what the responsibility is, and I will use that as my gold standard and guide. Of course, we can go to our FAR AIM in Part 61 for the CFI requirements and privileges and limitations, and in there we can clearly see what it is that we need to do. For example, for a student pilot, we need to have an endorsement for our SFAR 73. We need to have a solo endorsement. We need to have endorsement for their solo cross-country flights that need to take place. And of course, they need to have an endorsement for both the written and the Checkride before they can sit for the final exams. Logbook endorsements is part of proper record keeping. Now, one of the things that we know from a regulation standpoint, the pilot in command can be logged by both the CFI and the student pilot, as long as this is an instructional flight. If this is a pleasure flight, non-instructional flight, then only the pilot in command, who's properly endorsed to conduct his flight, can take credit for being pilot in command. Right? That's one of the privileges of a CFI, that you can log that time to build time with a student together. In FAR Part 91, there are operational regulations, including pre-flight responsibilities, the weather minimums, and helicopter-specific regulations. I always say, I summarize it this way. It is a true privilege to be able to fly in helicopter, because we get to fly low and slow, and essentially we can go wherever we want to go. The key is it always has to be done in a safe manner, safe to the environment, that is, noise pollution to our neighbors. This could be safe away from any kind of obstacles. You could be safe if you go for pinnacle landing, if there's any people around. The general guidelines of being 500 feet above a non-congested or 1,000 feet over a congested area, yes, these all hold true, but there are exceptions for helicopters to be able to fly that with permission, but we always have to maintain safe conditions and safety margins, allowing for emergency procedures in case of an engine failure or tail rotor failure or any other emergencies that we have discussed. I have an outline that I can use to go through each of the specific endorsements that are required for a CFI itself. I've given the description of the pitot-static systems, and the last part of it really is talking about the teaching of different types of maneuvers. The goal when we go out to fly later, as a CFI student, it is my responsibility to actually fly the aircraft from beginning to end. But I want to be able to speak through everything that I do by using simple commands, that right pedal, left cyclic, like right cyclic, aft pressure, or raising or lowering the collective itself. The goal is not to overwhelm the student with information that they simply cannot process or make any sense out of. Use a stepped approach, and I love the approach of see one, do one, teach one, is by demonstrating the maneuver, answering questions, by guiding them through the maneuver, and then get to the point that they can actually teach the maneuver back to you. And because this is done, there are three components that you can do it pre-flight. We can stand at the board for that particular day, decide what it is that we're going to be learning. So, for example, we want to talk about settling with power. Before we go out, we would have a whiteboard session and have a discussion how we're going to set it up, the importance of trying to keep the nose into the wind itself, what a safe altitude is, and why we were choosing to be at a higher altitude than normal. What the difference between a forward out flight versus the Richard maneuver. And then once we have a deeper understanding of that, to leave the technical stuff in the office and go out and fly in order to be able to demonstrate it in flight. Once we have demonstrated, we can have a quick formative review while in flight, meaning, hey, this went well, this didn't go well, let's do this again and again until we get a level of proficiency. Again, after 2 or 3 times, you might want to move on to the next maneuver and come back to it if necessary. And then, of course, once we return from the flight back at base, we can have a deeper dive into the maneuver itself and discuss anything that might have went well or didn't go well. It is really about the practice under supervision, right? It's giving and really is the most difficult thing for the CFI, is to allow the student to experience without over manipulating the controls. And I think that as you gain competency and confidence as a CFI, that you can really rescue the student if you let them go. It's not, it really comes down to less and less pressure on the collective, cyclic, and pedals, allowing the student to experience what the inputs that they're making is actually doing to the flight characteristic itself. This is not so easy, right? It is, especially if you have somebody who's new, as a new CFI or as a new student. But it is really important to have for the student to have this input of understanding: is this me or is this you? Having a discussion about analyzing and providing feedback around mistakes is not done in flight, right? This is really because once we talked about that earlier in the fundamentals, is if you start critiquing a person in flight, they often become defensive. So it's lower brain thinking. They often can no longer process. There's already so many things happening. Concentrate on the flight, and then have a proper post briefing in order to be able to get a deeper understanding of what is taking place and to continue to learn from that, right? Is that I call it fail fast, fail forward. I've made lots of mistakes that probably could have led to poor outcomes. Thank God I had a good CFI next to me and we was able to recognize it and make these corrections. I hope to be able to be in that same position. But I got to experience these for myself, and I obviously survived all of them, but I learned from them and less likely to make them into the future again. It's really, really important of our training program. Set goals for improvement, right? It is that don't set realistic, smart, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. Right? Don't expect that they can grow and learn at the same rate as you did. We all have strengths and weaknesses. It's our goal to be able to have a gradual progression to an end goal. And that progression is really part of the student teacher relationship on how quickly you push too hard, it will fall apart. You're way too slow, you're burning up money that is not yours to burn. Right, so you need to find that middle ground in order to be able to find to get the student to adapt, to adjust, and to correct, and get to a level of competency. And then, of course, repetition leads to mastery over time. And I think that anybody who says, "Listen, I become a master in 200 hours of flying," is a fool. Right? People who have 2,000 hours or 8 hours, but will still tell you, or at least they should tell you, that they continue to learn. I just watched a very interesting, a clip online about a guy had been. He said he had like 12,000 hours of flying helicopters, and now went back to get a CFI. And the question is, why? Well, I don't want to teach, but I knew that if I took my CFI, I challenged myself. And he said, I've learned a tremendous amount. Because in the real world, there's the things you start cutting corners, right? It's not the right way to do that, but that is a phenomenon that does take place. Of course, positive reinforcement, and we call that 4x1, right? It's 4 times love versus 1 time tough love. If you critique them all of the time without them feeling good about what it is that they're trying to conduct, well, the likelihood of having a positive outcome and the person wants to stick with you is less likely, right? It's a responsibility to build this true relationship. Now, I will say this. There are times you're not going to have the right chemistry with a student. It is the responsibility of the mentor, the teacher, to recognize that, to feedback from the student itself, and sometimes you need to hand them off to somebody else. Again, this is a business where people are exchanging money for a service. It is irresponsible and unethical for us to take money from somebody who's not learning under our guidance. It is our responsibility to be able to hand them off, have a discussion with the other CFIs, and see who might be able to work with them and find their style better to adaptive learning by the student itself. And then, of course, the key teaching techniques on the end of the day, this, we call chunking, is breaking the things down to smaller components. And hovering is one of those examples we talked about, right? Start with the cyclic, and then the collective, and then the pedals. But you can do that through all of that. Make it scenario-based so it's easier for the student to remember what it is that you're doing, right? And repetition and reflection allows continuous growth and development of the student itself. So with that said, and that's really the conclusion of today's presentation, and it's slightly in overtime, 2 hours and 18 minutes into it. It is, we can recap, right? That learning to fly is difficult, and it's very dependent on the student, how much time the student has. And we as CFIs have to make adjustments to their needs. And that is the key, right? It is not about my way of teaching it. It's about how they learn. The quicker I can adapt to that, and we have this continuous, cycle of improvement, the quicker the student will learn and make a progression. This is a good time in the cycle to also ask for feedback from the student or the DPE and dive a little deeper into areas of concern. And that's really about it. We have resources on the table that we drew information from. Again, is our helicopter flying handbook, the FAA Aviation Instructors Handbook, the PTS standards, the FAR AIM 2024 edition, helicopter-specific training manuals like our pilot operating handbook for the 22 or 44, all of our other associated materials, and of course our fellow CFIs who have been there and done that before. I did include in the handout to the DPE different schematics and drawings, including an empty slide, so we can use that for our total progress. With that said, I think this is my lesson plan for I visualize successful program, as you can hear in my own voice, especially the teaching the slides. Continue to fine tune through repetition. You get deeper learning and deeper understanding. It becomes more natural learning the slides in the progressive orders. And so you can have kind of like a story to tell rather than just reading off the slides, which is never my goal to do. But again, as I was told, to make sure that if you have a slide up, to make sure to cover the components of what is on the slide. With that said, I hope this is useful and helpful to anybody who's going to prepare for the CFI exam. I'll let you know at the back end, or you look at for a nice picture online. If you see me with a white piece of paper at the end of October, then you know that I was successful and that the DPE found this program and this setup for the oral portion of the CFI exam acceptable. Thank you, everybody, and I really appreciate it, and we'll talk soon again. Hi, I'm Walter. I'm the Dutch Mentor, or you can see me and find me on Instagram or YouTube at Fly with the Dutch Mentor. Come join the conversation, as we are always better together, and learning is a process that takes us a lifetime. Thank you, and be well.